Good afternoon. We'll get started at this point. My name's John Van Ingen, member of the Philosophy Department.
Hey, Paul.
And I welcome you. The Philosophy Department welcomes you to our Philosophy Department Colloquium program. And we have the honor of having Dr. Philip Rolnick here today. And as you know, it's a very interesting, exciting, ongoing topic. So Dr. Rolnick received his doctorate at Duke University in 1989, taught at Greensboro College in North Carolina from 89 to 2003, came to St. Thomas in 2003. He's a professor of theology here. He serves as a chair, as chair of the Science and Theology Network, a group that promotes public events and faculty research in science and theology here in the Twin Cities. As author of many theological books and articles, his three major research areas have been analogy, how words refer to God, what personhood means for Christian faith, and the relation of science and Christian theology. He has been the recipient of the Exemplary Teacher Award of Greensboro College, several Templeton Foundation grants, a North Carolina Humanities Scholar, and the University Scholars Grant from St. Thomas. He has been a member of Princeton Center of Theological Inquiry and Notre Dame Seminar on Human Distinctiveness. His latest book, Origins, God, Evolution, and the Question of the Cosmos, was published in October of 2015 and has been nominated for 3 national awards. At St. Thomas, Phil has developed and taught a course on the theology and literature of C.S. Lewis, which he will begin teaching again in the coming spring semester. Today, the title of his talk is C.S. Lewis's Battle Against Cultural Relativism. I give you Dr. Philip Rolnick.
Well, you know, I'm thinking of the time when, this being an election season, when President Calvin Coolidge, long ago, who was a churchgoer, and Coolidge had gone to church that Sunday without his wife, who was apparently not feeling well, and so Coolidge was a man of notoriously few words, and when he got home, Mrs. Coolidge said, "How was it?" He said, "Fine." Mrs. Coolidge, trying to prompt him, as was her wont, said, "Well, how was the sermon?" He said, "It was good." "Well, what was the sermon about?" "Sin." "Well, what did he say?" "He was against it." We're going to get a little more complicated than that. This topic it gets that way, that we're about to do. So there you see a picture of Lewis as a boy, and there you see him on the cover of Time magazine. I think this was 1947. So he became quite famous during the World War, especially during World War II. But now let's, okay, let's see. We're having, okay, bad sign. Okay. We may have, it always works while the tech guy's here. Okay, can you, I can't see it, it's gotta be this. It's gotta be that, no? To advance it. So let's see, press N on the N. You play with the battery? Oh.
Without the little tip. I'll get
It
it.
w- All right. Well, while we're having the technical difficulty, I'll go ahead and begin the talk. Okay. First thing I wanted to bring to your attention was an event in or around the year 1849 during the British rule in India. During this time, Hindu priests approached Major General Charles James Napier, the British general, to complain about the British prohibition of sati, which is the Hindu practice of burning widows alive with their deceased husband. Napier was being pressured, and he responded to the request as follows. He said, "Be it so. This burning of widows is your custom. Prepare the funeral pyre. But my nation also has a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them and confiscate their property. My carpenters shall therefore erect gibbets on which to hang all concerned when the widow is consumed. Let us all act according to our national customs." Since this dramatic clash of cultures and religions, Hindus no longer burn women alive when their husbands have died. There have been some infamous exceptions. Now, when I ask St. Thomas students about this episode, and I ask them if they are in favor of sacrificing widows, of course, the immediate and unanimous response is, of course we're against that. Now, when I ask the same students if the British general did the right thing, there is always hesitation, discomfort, and hedging. Our students and many of our faculty have drunk deeply from the well of cultural relativism. So, now, first job, defining cultural relativism and its kissing cousin, which is subjectivism. The basic claim is simple. There is no overarching universal truth. In cultural relativism, different groups say different things about what is true. Who is to say what's true for all? So it ends up being a truth defeater, a defeater for the concept of truth where no one gets to say. In subjectivism, different individuals say different things about what is true, and the same question, who's to say what's true for all? Your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. This is a conversation I know you've all had, perhaps at home, perhaps in the dormitory. Oh, there you see General Napier, and there you see a Hindu, thanks, Dr. Gebler. You see the actual textual portrayal. I don't have any live shots of burning widows alive, but the woman on top is alive. The man underneath, of course, is already deceased. Now, let's go, thank you, this era. Thank you. Let's take a moment and define, get a working definition of truth. Let us say for our purposes today that truth is, quote, contact with reality. So, now this was a definition first put forth by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and later exploited by Michael Polanyi, the great Hungarian thinker. So, there's a relationship between the human mind and reality. The contact can be on any level, physical, psychological, social, or spiritual. The contact can come from human effort or from revelation, from God. But please note, truth is not synonymous with reality. Truth is about our approach to reality. Truth is not just about what we think, it is equally about the reality we are trying to think about. Truth is the first victim, but not the last, of cultural relativism and subjectivism. If there is no universal overarching truth, morality, which is based on truth, must share its fate. C.S. Lewis had dire warnings about relativism. Lewis issued these warnings about educational experts, we've certainly seen plenty of those, who would attempt to improve our morality or condition us, or in a more recent phrase, to raise our consciousness about this or that issue. Lewis wrote, "Out of this apparently innocent idea comes the disease that will certainly end our species, and in my view, damn our souls if it is not crushed. The fatal superstition that men can create values, that a community can choose its ideology as men would choose their clothes." Now, what Lewis meant by damn our souls is clear enough. What he apparently meant by end our species is that Western relativism is being globally transmitted like a viral disease. In this article, tellingly named "The Poison of Subjectivism," Lewis reiterates the warning: a philosophy which does not accept value as eternal and objective can lead us only to ruin. And if the first two warnings were not clear enough, he says, unless we return to the crude and nursery-like belief in objective values, we perish. The relativist might say that Lewis's tone is problematic. The talk of crushing an idea seems intemperate, even scary. But the relativist cannot say that Lewis is wrong, because from the relativist perspective, there is no right and wrong, there is no overarching truth. The relativist who said Lewis was wrong would be violating his own teaching. However, if relativism is in fact a threat to civilization and to the souls of those who adopt it, then clarity, not smoother manners or more moderated tone, is exactly what we need. Now, in this talk, I'm going to use subjectivism and cultural relativism. I'm going to abbreviate it as relativism, but it could be either one. They're really part of the same phenomenon. Affirming Lewis's claims, Peter Crift claims that no society has ever survived without rejecting moral relativism. Following Lewis, he contends that morality has become, quote, a fog of feeling, end quote. He believes that relativism, quote, has extinguished the light in the minds of our teachers and then their students, and eventually, if not reversed, will extinguish our whole civilization, end quote. So, knowing that there are many different views on relativism, and I suspect some of you may even embrace it, whether one embraces relativism or opposes it, it has unquestionably spread since Lewis's time and deepened in many, many cultural ways and religious ways. The problem is that relativism removes moral restraints. In Lewis's words, and I quote, "Correct thinking will not make good men of bad ones, but a purely theoretical error may remove ordinary checks to evil and deprive good intentions of their natural support," end quote. Most people will most of the time try to do the right thing, especially Minnesotans. But for all of us, there come times, days, or moments in days where we are tempted. It could be financial temptation, it could be sexual temptation, it could be academic temptation where you just didn't get the work done and you're taking a shortcut that's it's not really allowed by the honor code and so forth. And at such moments, precisely at such moments, social and religious restraints can bolster our own inner restraints. But in relativism, if you are a relativist, it's difficult even to make a case that there should be any restraints. Essentially, relativism removes both inner and outer restraints, leaving us only the rightness or wrongness of our own feelings. Okay, much of the issue of relativism turns on whether or not reality is a patterned givenness or merely a chaos. Lewis strongly believed that reality comes with intelligible patterns, that are patterns that can be understood, including patterns of morality that human reason can know. This belief is not only central to Christianity, but as Lewis in several works labored to argue, to religions and cultures around the globe. To recognize the givenness of reality is to recognize reality as a gift, as a grace of creation. However, in saying this, I have come dangerously close to lapsing into theology at a philosophy talk. But givenness is one of those boundary issues that matter greatly to both philosophy and theology. The issue plays out in the difference between discovery and raw invention. In discovery, we are finding something already present, something given. In invention, we ourselves are creating the reality. This distinction forcefully applies to morality. Is it something we discover or something we make up ex nihilo? In Lewis's famous opening to Mere Christianity, he presents a philosophical case for the givenness of morality. He does so through a surprising and creative and common sense analysis of quarreling. Quarreling may seem unpleasant, but it reveals something deeper. Because in a quarrel, someone is appealing to a standard that the other knows about but is allegedly not meeting. The accused will rarely disavow the common standard, but will typically claim that there is some special application, excuse, or exemption that applies to his case. Quarreling attempts to show that the other is in the wrong according to a common standard that both parties in the quarrel acknowledge. Now, it's not that everybody, starts out consciously acknowledging it. It's just that they both assume it of each other. Absent this recognition of a common standard, the two could, quote, fight like animals, end quote, but they could not quarrel. Now, this is typical Lewis. He takes something common and he does a rather brilliant analysis of it. After establishing this kind of a base of a common standard, Lewis gives it various names, such as the moral law, the standard of decency, or the law of human nature. Elsewhere, he refers to it as the Tao of Confucianism, the Rita of Hinduism, or the natural law of Catholicism. Just as all bodies are subject to gravitation, human beings are subject to the law of human nature, but with one crucial distinction. Gravity cannot be disobeyed. Human beings can and do disobey the moral law, the law of human nature. The law, for us, must first be recognized, and then we have to choose to obey it. Lewis further illustrates the law by two cases of someone taking his preferred seat on a train. The English, when he was alive, constantly were taking trains, so it was a very common thing for people to talk about preferred seats, corner seats on a train, and so forth. In the first case, the other person got there first and occupied his favorite spot. In the second, the other slipped in while his back was turned, after he already had the seat, moved his bag and took his seat. The first situation creates an inconvenience. The second is more serious. The other man, in the second case, has violated the law of human nature. Now, with these things in place, Lewis starts to take on objections to the law. So here's the first set of objections. First objection. Herd instinct accounts for the allegedly moral standard. There is actually no existing moral standard. This is what the relativist would say. Lewis acknowledges that there may be a herd instinct prompting us to behave a certain way, such as helping others in need. But hearing a cry of someone in danger, you may be subject to two conflicting interests. First, help the other. Second, flee from danger and save yourself. A third thing must adjudicate between the two, telling you to suppress the urge to run away and save yourself, and instead put yourself in danger and help the other. But the thing that judges between the two cannot be one of the two. Second objection. When two instincts conflict, the stronger will prevail. Against this objection, Lewis argues that moral law will often tell us to side with the weaker of the two impulses, for instance, for helping rather than for our own safety. Objection 3. The moral law is merely one of our instincts. Against this objection, Lewis argues that moral law can sometimes encourage us toward a behavior and at other times discourage the same behavior. He compares it to the keys of a piano. None of the keys in themselves are right or wrong. It depends on the piece being played. In fact, Lewis thinks it dangerous to take any one rule and make it the whole, a common error of those who take only one aspect, for instance, of a tradition, those who mistakenly substitute a part for the whole. Fourth objection, the moral law is merely social convention. Against this objection, Lewis allows that many behaviors conform to the moral law and have been taught to us as social convention. However, having been taught decent behavior does not mean that decent behavior is merely human invention. We were all taught the multiplication tables when we were at school, but that teaching does not mean that we invented the laws of mathematics. Had you grown up on a desert island without having been taught multiplication, the laws of multiplication would still exist. Whether or not a 7-year-old has been taught that 5 times 5 is 25 does not affect its truth. Likewise with the moral law. Now this we're going to move into Lewis's idea that emotions are terribly important in this discussion. It's not just raw logic, it's also emotions. It's part of the whole human being. So in another famous essay called, beautifully, Men Without Chess, Lewis argues that emotional states must be trained to align with reason, noble character, and the moral law. Education's task is to promote this alignment. His argument begins with a polemic against a high school English text. A polemic is a war of words. Polemus is the Greek word for war, so when in discourse, a polemic isn't trying to hear what the other guy's saying, it's trying to defeat what the other guy's saying. So in Lewis actually, this famous essay, Men Without Chess, it's really a polemic against a high school English book, which Lewis called the Green Book, and he called the two authors, Gaius and Titius, in order not to shame the two, because Lewis was already famous, and he didn't want to punch down and hit younger and less advanced colleagues. He was quite the gentleman and the Christian about this. But Lewis thought that what they were doing was seriously wrong, and this is why. He counters their attempts to debunk, that's their word, the validity of feeling certain things rather than others, a debunking that is virtually synonymous with our recent term from postmodernism, deconstructing. The case under discussion is Samuel Coleridge's story of people standing near a powerful waterfall. One calls the waterfall sublime, and the other says, "Oh, isn't it pretty?" Coleridge affirms the sublimity, and he critiques the one who said this is just pretty. But Gaius and Titius would have their students believe, and I'm quoting them here, when the man said, "This is sublime," he appeared to be making a statement about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was really saying was, "I have sublime feelings." End quote. Lewis is aghast to see high school students subjected to this corrupt, subtly disguised philosophy. According to Gaius and Titius, and I quote again, "We appear to be saying something very important about something. And actually, we are only saying something about our own feelings." Now, this is just subjectivism, a form of subjectivism often called emotivism. Rejecting emotivism, Lewis wants young people to receive the givenness of reality. We quote, "The feelings which make a man call an object sublime are not sublime feelings, but feelings of veneration." If "this is sublime" is to be reduced at all to a statement about the speaker's feelings, the proper translations would be, "I have humble feelings." Lewis then has some logical fun, and I quote, "You are contemptible" means I have contemptible feelings. In fact, that your feelings are contemptible means my feelings are contemptible. End quote. Lewis is trying, in his playful way, to get us to respect the object that confronts us, whether it be physical or invisible and moral, to allow the discovery of what is there, of what is given. Lewis has two basic concerns about teaching students the likes of the Green Book. And I think we've all seen the Green Book in our own education. And the many similar approaches that there are, like things like values clarification that were floating around in education. Statements of value are reduced to statements about the speaker's feelings. That's his first concern. And the second, statements of value thus become trivial and unimportant. By contrast, Lewis thinks that educators are doing great harm when they attempt to strip sentiment from youth. He counters, quote, "My own experience as a teacher tells an opposite tale. For every one pupil who needs to be guarded from excess of feeling or sensibility, there are 3 who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity." The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts, end quote. This line is so typically, beautifully Lewis. Lewis then cites Aristotle with favor, and I quote, this is from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. "The aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought," end quote. This Aristotelian teaching would shock many St. Thomas students, perhaps some of you, because it stands in the starkest opposition to relativism. It implies that there is a community of knowers who actually know something, a tradition which teachers and parents must transmit to pupils and to which pupils must submit. Similarly, in the Republic, Plato wants youth, quote, "to give delighted praise to beauty, receiving it into his soul and being nourished by it, so that he becomes a man of gentle heart. All this before he is of an age to reason." You see, it's preparation. And Plato continues, "so that when reason at length comes to him, then bred as he has been, he will hold out his hands in welcome," end quote. Like Plato and Aristotle, Lewis sees training in sentiment as a preparation for more mature and advanced thinking. But Lewis understood his debt to tradition, to all those who had labored, discovered, and transmitted their discoveries. He was in many ways a great man who was able to make great contributions because he humbly recognized his debt to all those who had gone before him. Even in a natural phenomenon like a waterfall, Lewis wanted us to see that objects do not merely receive our approval or disapproval. They merit things like our reverence or contempt. Essentially, Lewis wants students to recognize and respect the givenness of reality. Giving things their due actually is the fulfillment of Socrates' definition of justice. By contrast, the trivialization of emotion fits well the general tenets of relativism, encouraging a hermeneutic of suspicion in young people who would be far better served by a program of positive discovery. Students and faculty must understand before they criticize. In a world where there is no overarching truth, encouraging students to start with critique, criticism, thinking critically, and suspicion adds fuel to a very bad and harmful fire. What looks like a quibble about an English textbook turns out to be an expose of far weightier matters, like the corrupting effect of relativism on ethics and theology. Second set of objections that Lewis takes on that you've undoubtedly heard or perhaps even mentioned yourself. The everybody is so different argument, first objection. Lewis directly takes on this argument, perhaps the most common of all, that against overarching principles of morality. The oft-heard claim that different cultures have vastly different ethical standards, that there is no common tradition. Lewis is characteristically clear. I quote, "The answer is, that is a lie. A good, solid, resounding lie," end quote. The claim that there are no common moral principles is simply ignorant of history and world religions. Lewis suggests that a few hours in a library will dispel the falsehood and replace it with a sense of, and I quote here, this is work that Lewis actually did on world religions. Here's Lewis, "the massive unanimity of the practical reason in man, from the Babylonian hymn to Samos, from the laws of Manu, the Book of the Dead, the Analects, the Stoics, the Platonists, from Australian Aborigines and Redskins. He will collect the same triumphantly monotonous denunciations of oppression, murder, treachery, and falsehood, the same injunctions of kindness to the aged, the young and the weak, of almsgiving and impartiality and honesty. He will no longer doubt that there is such a thing as the law of nature, end quote. Lewis concedes that there are blindnesses and differences between the cultures, but one gets the overwhelming sense that there is this law of nature, an internal sense of moral principles that human beings simply have. And quoting again from Lewis, far from finding a chaos, we find exactly what we should expect. Exactly what we should expect if good is indeed something objective and reason the organ whereby it is apprehended. That is, a substantial agreement with considerable local differences of emphasis and perhaps no one code that includes everything, end quote. Lewis worked hard to show this universal sense of morality across cultures and religions. In The Abolition of Man, one of his great works, he includes a lengthy appendix, it's long, that details common moral teachings from diverse times, places, cultures, and religions. Lewis was a devout, full-spectrum Christian, but he recognized and learned from truth in other religions. It is not the Christian, but the relativist who must deny truth in other religions. Common ground is present for those energetic enough to look for it. As Peter Crift put it, try to imagine a society where justice, honesty, courage, wisdom, hope, and self-control were deemed morally evil, and unrestricted selfishness, cowardice, lying, betrayal, addiction, and despair were deemed morally good, end quote. The absurdity points to the commonness of this moral law among humanity. Beneath disagreements about lesser issues, there lies a basic agreement about the most important things. Second objection in this set, the argument that relativism is the most tolerant. Tolerance is now universally popular. Everybody's in favor of tolerance, and I am as well. And it seems a strong argument at first for the relativist to use against those of us who have these universal principles. Crift counters that, quote, tolerance is actually a quality of people, not of ideas, end quote. Moreover, Crift says, we do not tolerate goods. We tolerate only evils in order to prevent worse evils. The patient will tolerate the nausea brought on by chemotherapy in order to prevent death by cancer, end quote. Tolerance is quite different from affirming good in others. And as noted above, Christians can actively affirm much of what they find in other religions. So here's my conclusion of this particular thing on tolerance. Relativism appears polite and tolerant, but it is actually totally dismissive of others' highest values. Thus seen, it is really disrespectful. Third response to the objection. Traditional belief will block progress. Given the tenets of relativism, change is possible. You can have change, but you can't have progress. Progress can only take place if there is a standard to which we can approach or withdraw. Otherwise, the words better and worse have no meaning except for our own preferences. Human ideas can and should change. But if the goal keeps changing, there would be no way to assess progress, and most important, no common goal toward which to aim. To say that there is a universal moral principle, to say there is a Tao or a Rita or natural law, is not to say that I or my culture or my church has perfectly attained it. Apart from a universal unchanging standard, though, it makes no sense to speak of individual cultural and religious failures and inadequacies, let alone sin. And in relativism, there is no need for humility, unless you're in the mood for it. But our failures need not be fatal. I can progress from conversing with other individuals, and I can also learn from other cultures and religions. And finally, the said contra the, on the other hand, the against here. I think one of the best refutations of cultural relativism is Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. 20 centuries ago, Jesus first told his parable in a non-Christian culture on the other side of the planet, in a language quite different from English. Yet, intelligent readers throughout the ages have recognized the robbers as the bad guys, the priest and Levite as not very good guys, and the Samaritan as the hero of the story. The parable's central point of brotherly love for all people, even foreigners whom we may not know or may not like, has been discerned by all who read it, not just by Christians. In fact, at the time of its first telling, there were no Christians. Jesus' parable, which speaks globally and has spoken globally, cross-culturally, transculturally, in religions all over the world, you don't have to be a Christian to get the point of the parable. It's totally clear. I think it's an elegant refutation of the basic claims of relativism. Finally, or moving towards the conclusion now, power as a default position. If universal principles of morality fail, and this is where the spearhead of relativism gets serious, power steps into the vacuum. Writing in 1942, during the darkest days of World War II, Lewis notes how, quote, everyone, all the English, is indignant when he hears the Germans define justice as that which is to the interest of the Third Reich, end quote. However, Lewis notes that this indignation is totally groundless. If morality is subjective or merely biologically or culturally conditioned, like it or not, once an objective morality is rejected, once relativism becomes widely accepted, the default to power and self-interest is inevitable, whether of the individual, the nation, or the race. Cultural relativism comes on as politeness and tolerance and ends in totalitarian power-driven ideology. Lewis rightly observes that without an overarching good, one that overarches Germans, English, Japanese, and all humankind, quote, then of course the Nazis are as competent to create their ideology as we are to create ours, end quote. In cultural relativism and subjectivism, there can be no better and worse because there is no overarching standard by which to judge better and worse. As Lewis puts it, quote, unless the measuring rod is independent of the things measured, we can do no measuring. The measuring rod must be universal. Lewis's argument for principles of morality becomes explicitly Christian when he declares that none of us consistently and perfectly obey the moral law. He then adds that, quote, there is nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care how painful, dangerous, or difficult it is to do. If God is like the moral law, then he is not soft, end quote. As Lewis notes, we can ask forgiveness of a person, but not of the law. So given our failure to uphold the law, this is a recognition of our own humility. This is not a position of arrogance, it's a position that recognizes our own inadequacy, failure, and sometimes evil and sin. So, given our recognition of that and our recognition of our failure to uphold the law, we would be in inextricable difficulty if there were no options beyond the law. But of course, something beyond the law is precisely what Christianity offers. And here you see the quote, the Christian religion is, in the long run, a thing of unspeakable comfort, but it does not begin in comfort. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth. Lewis joins two fundamental imperatives: our allegiance to the universal moral law of nature and our allegiance to God, the ultimate source of moral principles, and the one in whom moral principles are infinitely and perfectly present. Lewis sees, quote, moral and religious experience converging to meet at infinity, end quote, an infinity of the living God. Morality is thus a stimulus, an awakening to a greater need, but only the relation to God proves to be ultimate. And finally, in concluding, The challenge of our age is not different from the challenge of our university. St. Thomas is living this challenge in its classrooms, in its attempts at core curriculum reviews, expanding into two-year college, and all the things that are going. It's happening here. It's not just somewhere else. This isn't just something that affected other people. The challenge of our age and the challenge of our university is the challenge of relativism that Lewis warned about so starkly in 1942, and that Cardinal Ratzinger articulated the night before his election as Pope. He spoke to the College of Cardinals on cultural relativism, among other things. What kind of men and women does relativism produce? Well, perhaps it's a wide variety. But as Crift observed, no society has ever survived without rejecting it. By contrast, what kind of men and women does the recognition of the givenness of moral law and the givenness of Jesus Christ produce? I believe that while we are increasing in kindness and gentleness, we should also learn to state who we are with greater clarity and a confidence restrained by humility. Let me close with a bon mot from the English writer Roger Scruton. I quote, "A writer who says there are no truths or that all truth is merely relative is asking you not to believe him. So don't." Thank you very much.
Now move into a question and answer period. And Zach is going to work that aisle, and I'll work this aisle, and we'll try to get the microphone in front of you when you ask your question. This is necessary for the recording and so on. So our tradition also is to start with student questions. So who would like to start?
Thank you. Could I just ask really quick, what works of C.S. Lewis some of the material you were covering at the beginning came from, particularly dealing with the Green Book?
Oh, that would be in the book. The book is called The Abolition of Man, and the essay was called Men Without Chess.
Oh, right. Okay.
But I was also using an article called The Poison of Subjectivism,
Right.
and several others as well.
Okay, so that also came from the Men Without Chess. Okay. Thank you.
That was an easy question, which I very much appreciate. Keep those coming.
Can you elaborate a little on your the connection between universal truth and beauty? Are they two different concepts? Are they kind of intertwined? Does one inform the other? And if so, how? And what I'm thinking of is that you had the analogy of the waterfall, and how is that? If that's objectively beautiful, my initial thought was if you're looking at it, probably, but if you're going down the waterfall, you have a different thought on how beautiful it is. And so with that, are they two different concepts? What's the relationship to each other?
Yeah, if I were dying as I was going through it, I might not be thinking, well, gee, this is beautiful. Yeah, it's a good point. But standing at a safe distance, I think there are certain things like waterfalls where we should pause and we should just take it in. And a physicist could take it in on a different level than a non-physicist in terms of what's causing the gravitational flow and what the water's made of and so forth, and the light playing on the waterfall and all those things. But the overall effect, the cumulative effect, should still impress you as beautiful. One of the nasty teachings that's about is beauty is only in the eye of the beholder, which I think is false for many different reasons, biological among others. Biologists have found that there are certain principles of symmetry that are part of the patterns of creation that will produce cross-culturally positive responses even in newborns. So to get to the heart of your big question, which was about the relationship of beauty and was it truth? Okay. Well, I would say all three are intimately connected: beauty, truth, and goodness. There's a wonderful movie. If you haven't seen it, you should all see it before midnight tonight, called Babette's Feast. It's just a gorgeous movie where it's really about how you need all three of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And you need these because these are the characters of divinity, the characters, God's character, that are available to us. So I think beauty can refresh our understanding of truth. They're intertwined in a way. Now, we can separate them out, but in the divine character in God, that's all one, the true, the good, and the beautiful. It's certainly not the false, the evil, and the ugly. So thanks for that. Yes?
Thank you. If I may, just a thought I had to respond to that before I have my own question. It occurred to me when you mentioned if you're going down the waterfall that it doesn't seem beautiful. But if you knew for certain going down the waterfall that you would not be even hurt, you might find it very beautiful, you know. There would be a lot of, I think it would be awesome if I could go down a waterfall and not get hurt. Because there would be a lot of stuff I could see about the waterfall I can't see otherwise. So, but my question for you is regarding the kind of 4 objections to the moral standard. Could you clarify and kind of explain a little more the idea of the moral standard being just one of our instincts and why that's false?
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, Lewis says we have different instincts. So Lewis is allowing, the evolutionary teachings were coming through in the early 20th century when Lewis was at his prime. And he was taking them seriously. He was saying, okay, maybe it is something that's inbred in us. It's just part of being this kind of an animal that we have these kind of help each other out. And maybe there are instances where monkeys will help each other out against an attack by an eagle and so forth, that in Darwin's writing he actually mentions that, where they quite courageously, these monkeys quite courageously defended against an attack by an eagle on a young monkey. So they kind of mobbed it, they swarmed it, and they drove off the eagle. So this herd instinct may be present, but another instinct that's present is save your life when you're being confronted by great danger. Don't just sit around and wait till you get killed. If somebody's coming at you, get out of there. So you might be in a situation, say somebody was drowning in a river, and say it's a bad kind of flood situation where you got a bad choice. You're either going to go in and risk your own life trying to pull somebody out, or you're going to just get out of there while you can because the water's rising. So you have 2 conflicting instincts. So you really need a third to adjudicate, to make the decision, the judgment between them. That's his argument anyway. Thank you.
Do you have any,
John's up. Right. Yeah. Well, let's do the last part first, and the Dawkins example. There's been tremendous literature in biology, among biologists, that say, well, genes aren't really selfish. They actually cooperate far more. And if your genes did compete against each other, you'd probably be dead.
Well, that's what he says the gene cares about God, right? Not about you. So what he thinks is the gene actually makes us happy or the player.
Right.
It's selfish, not
Right.
that it makes us selfish.
Yeah. Well, John, that's a helpful addition to what I was talking about. Now, there's when these things do have different definitions. I was specifically throughout this talk, the nihilistic one of subjectivism and relativism in the denial of truth. Not just that if I think it, it makes it true, which is a different problem, but just that there really isn't an overlying objective moral truth because, see, everybody disagrees. And so those disagreements, and what Lewis was trying to say to that was, that's really ignorant because on the really big things, people really don't disagree.
Right. But when the nihilist says, yeah, we agree with that, they don't. But the way they want to put it forward now is we can explain this, right, more simply by just saying these beliefs allow species to survive. And that's why we hold them to the left. And they wouldn't say it's better than species. That's sort of what they say. I mean, I don't agree with you on this.
Right.
What you say about that piece of the view now. No, I'm going to say this is kind of a social Darwinism
Yeah.
brought to a super extreme. Even things like, yeah, of course we don't have free will, but somehow our believing we have free will allows us to survive. I've seen top advertising like that with the view of them, and they want to explain all these beliefs as having some sort of survival value, even though they're false. They think they're false.
Well, there's a fine philosopher at Yale, John Hare, H-A-R-E, son of the elder Hare. Yeah. I've forgotten the elder's name, but he was one of these British empiricists. And John Hare had this thing he called the publicity standard. And he said basically in the publicity standard that, okay, if you've got this thing that you see, it's all a trick of evolution, all these good things we're doing. And now that we've gotten really smart, we know the trick. He said, well, the problem is the more you advertise that it's all a trick and an illusion, it's not going to work. And that's going to actually defeat, it's going to be anti-survival. It's going to ruin your chances at survival. So Hare's very skeptical, as am I, about this notion. What I do notice, Professor Honan, is that again and again, they're just attacks. And the attacks they all tend to be on the same thing, which is something like, that counts like truth, that you can make a contact with reality. Remember, truth isn't just, it's not just about us. It's always us and reality. And truth and reality are not the same thing. It's a beautiful contact between the human intellect and reality, on whatever level it is. And this is what's always being denied in one way or another. It's the latest and greatest hit of that.
Is there, for a last question, is there something locally that you see as a problem with relativism?
Well, yeah, there is. And I would say that is called the silliness of this banner that's all over campus, all for the common good. Now, it has come to my attention that students will sometimes include that as a kind of a sarcastic hashtag or sign off on Facebook or in emails with all for the common good. And the problem with all for the common good is really, that's what is related to our talk in a sense today. And that is that it's so vague. It invites everybody who's in the game to define the goal just about any way you want to define the goal, which looks a whole lot like relativism, doesn't it? So it's perfect for a relativist. But you might wonder, well, gee, at the University of St. Thomas, Catholic University, Christian University, why? Is that the best we can say? Because here's the problem. It can be taken in so many opposing directions. So rather than really a common starting point, it's a deliberate emptiness, a kind of a faux premise. It says nothing of substance, but because it pretends to say something of substance, but in saying nothing, it takes up the space of something that could be substantive. And this space-taking isn't innocent. It's actually quite injurious, because it allows each individual to imagine his own starting point. And again, that looks a lot like relativism. So if I were going to try to solve all the problems of St. Thomas today, about core curriculum review, two-year colleges, and everything else, I would just propose this alternative to our banner and slogan. I would say, through Jesus Christ and guided by the teachings of his church, we seek to discover truth and to serve the common good. But see, then we'd have an anchor. We'd have a goal. We'd have a definition. And we'd still fight. We'd fight about all kinds of, we'd still argue because that's who we are. We all see things differently and so forth. But we wouldn't fight about our own self-identity. And we wouldn't get in the kind of discussions that really call into question our self-identity. So, yeah.
How about solo dance?
I'm sorry?
What do you think of solo dance?
I like it. That'd be fine. You're going with Bach and Luther there. Okay, good. So, yeah, anything. That's just a for instance, John, about something that would work because it would give us some definition. Well, folks, can I just thank you all for taking the time to come this afternoon?